The Marrow Thief, the City of Glass Chains. A sequel to The Marrow Thief. Prologue. What comes after? Death, I've learned, is not the end. Neither, it turns out, is moving on. When Yenna and I dissolved into the light beneath the white blossom tree in Ashenmere's garden, I expected peace. The real kind, not the exhausted sleep of someone who's fought too long and earned their rest, but the genuine article. Silence. Stillness. The sensation of laying down a weight you've carried so long you forgot it was there. Instead, I woke up. Not the way you wake from sleep, disoriented and grasping for the threads of a dream. More like surfacing from deep water, the world arriving in layers, sound first, then sensation, then light. I was standing on a road I'd never seen, in a city I didn't recognize, wearing clothes I couldn't remember choosing. Yenna was beside me. She looked exactly as she had in the last years of our haunt, semi-transparent, slightly luminous, both legs intact in death in a way they'd never been in life. "Where are we?" I asked. "No idea," she said, squinting at the skyline. "But look at those chains." She was right. The city before us was beautiful. Towers of pale stone, canals of still water, bridges arching between districts like stone rainbows. But every building, every tower, every bridge was wrapped in chains. Not iron chains. Glass. Chains made of translucent crystal that caught the weak sunlight and scattered it into cold fragments of color. The chains weren't decorative. They pulsed with something, a dark energy I recognized the way you recognize a smell from childhood, deep in your bones before your mind catches up. Marrow essence. "Oh no," I said. "Oh yes," Yenna replied, and her tone was the one I knew well, half dread, half excitement, the tone of someone who has already decided they're going to do the stupid, dangerous, necessary thing and is just waiting for their partner to catch up. I looked around for some sign of how we'd gotten here, some clue about what was expected of us. Instead, I found a folded piece of paper tucked into my jacket pocket, a jacket that definitely hadn't been on my body when we dissolved into the light. The paper read, in handwriting I almost recognized, Velundra. Last major Marrow Lord, stronghold on the continent. Population, 180,000 living, approximately 400,000 hollow. 3 lord families in control. Something different here, worse than Ashenmere. The chains aren't just holding the hollow in place. They're keeping something else from getting out. Good luck. You'll need it. P. Who's P? Yenna asked, reading over my shoulder. Petra, I guessed. It's her handwriting. Older than I remember it, but hers. Petra. The child who'd grown into a soul speaker in Ashenmere, who'd helped dozens of confused dead find their peace. Apparently she'd found her own kind of peace, and from whatever vantage point that gave her, she could still meddle in the affairs of the living. "So we were sent here," I said. "Pushed," Yenna corrected. "There's a difference. Being sent implies someone's in charge of this. Being pushed just means something needed to happen, and we happen to be the ones capable of doing it." I looked at the glass-chained city of Velundra, at the hollow moving through its streets, not the shuffling, mindless procession I remembered from Ashenmere, but something different. These hollow moved in lockstep, perfectly synchronized, like a single organism wearing thousands of bodies. And between them, ordinary-looking people lived their lives, working, trading, arguing, laughing, not servants of the Marrow Lords, not obviously oppressed, just people. In a city wrapped in glass chains they seemed not to notice. "Worse than Ashenmere," I murmured, remembering what the note had said. "How is this worse?" "I suppose," Yenna said, rolling up her sleeves, "we're about to find out." We walked into Velundra. And as we crossed the city's threshold, I felt it. The glass chains didn't just wrap around buildings. They ran beneath the earth, through the streets, through the very air. A web of crystalline marrow magic so vast and so fine that it was effectively invisible unless you knew what to look for. The whole city was a cage. The only question was, who was it built to contain? Part 1. The Glass City. Velundra was nothing like Ashenmere. Where Ashenmere had worn its death openly, grey streets, skeletal architecture, the constant procession of obviously dead hollow, Velundra was almost pleasant, almost normal. A prosperous canal city with well-maintained buildings, a functioning market, street vendors selling food that smelled of actual spices rather than preservation chemicals. The hollow here were different too. In Ashenmere, you could spot them immediately. The empty eyes, the mechanical shuffle, the faint shimmer of the spells keeping them from rotting. Here they were dressed well, moved smoothly, even smiled. If not for the total absence of expression behind those smiles, you might mistake them for the living. "They look almost human," Yenna said quietly as we moved through a market district. "They look curated," I replied. "Like someone spent a lot of time making them look human." She thought about that. Why bother? In Ashenmere, the lords never cared how the hollow appeared. They were tools. In Ashenmere, everyone knew what the hollow were. Here. I watched a hollow woman hand change to a customer, her movements perfectly natural, her face arranged into a pleasant mask. Here I don't think everyone knows. That landed like a stone in still water. We both stood with the ripples of it. "They're hiding it," Yenna said finally. "The soul trade, the hollow, all of it, from their own people. That's my guess. The living go about their lives thinking this is just a normal city. Maybe they notice things are a little strange, a little too smooth, a little too quiet at night. But they don't know the whole truth." "Which makes it worse," Yenna said. "Ashenmere was a horror, but at least it was an honest horror. This is a lie," I said. "A very beautiful, very well-maintained lie. We needed information. In Ashenmere we'd had Maven, a hollow who retained consciousness, who could guide us through the system from inside. We had no such contact here. What we had were ghost eyes, the ability to see things the living couldn't. The marrow flows through the glass chains, the soul light emanating from certain buildings, the dark absence of light from others, vaults, probably, where stolen essence was stored. And we had the one advantage that never failed us. People didn't expect ghosts to be curious. We drifted through the city over the next day, watching and listening. What we learned was troubling in ways I hadn't anticipated. The three ruling families of Velundra were called the Glass Court, House Veridine, House Som, and the most powerful, House Ashen. They didn't call themselves Marrow Lords here. They called themselves the Founders, and the official history of Velundra credited them with saving the city from a terrible plague 3 centuries ago. The plague was real. The salvation was not, or at least, not in the way the official history told it. What had actually happened, pieced together from old records and ghost whispers we collected in the quieter parts of the city, was this. 300 years ago, a genuine plague had swept through Velundra. Half the population died. In desperation, the city's most powerful alchemists had turned to soul magic, not to create immortality for themselves, but to stop the dying. They'd discovered that marrow essence, distributed carefully, could prevent the plague from taking hold. They'd saved the city. And then, like so many people who discover they hold power over life and death, they hadn't stopped. They'd kept harvesting, first from criminals, a convenient justification, then from the poor, then from anyone who couldn't fight back. 300 years of soul theft, dressed up as civic duty and public health. The Hollow in Velundra weren't just servants. They were also, Yenna and I discovered on our second day, the city's entire immune system. The glass chains distributed marrow essence through the city's air and water in microscopic amounts, maintaining a constant low-level infusion that kept the living population healthy, young-looking, and subtly dependent on the system without ever knowing it. Remove the chains, and the population wouldn't just lose their servants. They'd lose their health, their longevity, possibly their lives. "They've made the whole city an addict," Yenna said, sitting on the steps of an empty building while we processed what we'd learned. "Without the chains, without the Hollow, everyone suffers." "It's elegant," I admitted, hating that it was true. In Ashenmere, anyone could theoretically survive without the Marrow Lords. It would be hard, but possible. Here, they've made themselves essential. So even if we free the souls, even if we break the chains, people die, I finished. Or at least, they suffer badly. Withdrawal from marrow essence after 300 years of exposure. I don't know what that looks like, but I doubt it's pleasant. We sat with that for a while. The original Marrow Thief job in Ashenmere had been relatively clean in retrospect. Destroy the choir, free the souls, let the city heal. The Hollow had woken up, essence had been returned to the earth, and yes, it had been chaotic and difficult, but the fundamental equation was simple. End exploitation, accept short-term pain for long-term freedom. Velundra's equation had extra variables. "We can't just blow it up," Yenna said. "No. We need someone on the inside. Someone who knows the system well enough to unwind it safely. Someone with both access to the glass court and reason to betray them," I added. "Anyone like that spring to mind?" I'd been thinking about this since our second hour in the city. There was one person, or what remained of a person, who fit that description. I'd spotted him on our first day, in the wealthy district near the canal, moving with the careful smoothness of a Hollow. But his eyes, like Maven's in another life, weren't quite empty. "There's a Hollow who works as an archivist for House Ashen," I said. "I've seen him twice. He carries old documents, property records, historical texts, and he reads them. Not like he's been ordered to transport them. Like he actually reads them." "A Hollow who reads for pleasure," Yenna said. "Familiar." "His name, according to the plaque on the building he works from, is Aldric, former head archivist of Velundra. The real one, before he died. Whatever they took from him, they didn't take the scholar." "Then we go talk to a dead librarian," Yenna said, standing up. "My favorite kind of Tuesday. Part 2. The Archivist." Finding Aldric alone was harder than expected. The Hollow in Velundra operated under tighter control than those in Ashenmere had. They moved in patterns, checked in at relay stations where their essential flow was monitored and adjusted, and were rarely left without at least visual contact from the glass court's overseers, living employees whose job was to ensure the dead stayed docile. But scholars have always found ways to be alone. It's practically a professional requirement. We caught Aldric in the subterranean section of Velundra's Grand Archive, in a restricted area accessible only to authorized staff, in a reading alcove tucked behind 3 rows of towering shelves. He was reading a book that, from the cover, appeared to be a 300-year-old record of pre-glass court property ownership. Not exactly recreational reading. Definitely intentional. I'd learned something in my years as a ghost. Announcing yourself to the living, or the mostly dead, was always more productive than dramatic reveals. People who are startled tend to do loud, unhelpful things. "Aldric," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "My name is Kael. I'm a ghost. The woman beside me is Yenna, also a ghost. We're not here to frighten you. We're here because we think you want the same thing we do." The Archivist went perfectly still. His hollow smooth performance didn't crack. That would have been too much to hope for. But his eyes moved. Deliberately. To me, then to Yenna, then to the door, then back to his book. A calculation. "The same thing," he said, after a long moment. His voice was the careful neutral of the hollow, but underneath it, faint as a heartbeat in a wall, was something else. Caution. Interest. "You're reading ownership records from before the glass court," I said. "You've been the Archivist here for how long? Before and after your death, combined." Another pause. 60 years before. 11 since. In 60 years plus 11, you know where every document in this archive is. Every record. Every secret the glass court has kept in written form. "What is it you want?" The question was still neutral, but there was something behind it now. Not quite hope. Something more careful than hope. "We want to dismantle what the glass court has built," I said simply. "But we can't do it the way it was done in other cities. We need to understand the chains, how they work, how they were built, whether they can be unwound without killing half the population in the process." The silence that followed was the longest yet. Then Aldric did something I hadn't expected. He closed his book, set it carefully on the shelf beside him, and turned to face us fully. And for just a moment, no more than a second, the hollow mask slipped. Underneath it was a man. Tired, angry, ancient with grief. "You've heard of Ashenmere," he said. "We lived there," Yenna replied. "More or less. The glass court has heard of it too. They've been preparing, ever since word reached them that the Marrow Lords there had fallen, reinforcing the chains, deepening the dependence." He looked at his hands, pale, still, preserved past their natural death. 71 years I've worked in this archive. 60 before I died, 11 since. I've read everything that comes through here. I know what they've done, what they're still doing. Then you know how to stop it. I know how it was built. Whether it can be safely dismantled, that's a different question. He looked at us steadily. "The dependency is real. I've seen the medical records from the early years, when the glass court first started distributing essence through the water supply. They conducted experiments. People who were cut off from the infusion experienced severe physical deterioration. Some died. How long ago were those experiments?" Yenna asked. 240 years. The population has had 3 centuries of low-level exposure. The dependency now would be. He trailed off, calculating. Significant. But not impossible to wean off. Nothing is impossible given enough time and care. But time is not something we have in abundance. Aldric glanced toward the archive entrance. The glass court knows something is coming. They increased the essence concentration in the water supply 3 months ago. More hollow woken from deeper sleep. More overseers on patrol. He paused. Someone has been asking questions. Among the hollow. Someone has been waking them. Yenna and I exchanged a look. "We just arrived," I said. "It wasn't us." "Then someone else was here first," Aldric said. "And the glass court is hunting them." The someone else, as it turned out, was a young woman named Thessaly, and she was currently in a great deal of trouble. We found her in a cellar beneath the Tanner's district, which was appropriate because it was the part of Velundra that smelled worst and was therefore least supervised. She'd been waking hollow for 6 weeks, not with any grand plan, but with the same basic method Maven had once demonstrated in Ashenmere, talking to them. Thessaly was 23 years old, small, with ink-stained fingers that suggested she'd recently had access to a printing press, and the reckless energy of someone who has just discovered a truth so large it's eating her alive from the inside. She was also, inconveniently, alive, which meant the glass court's overseer network could track her in ways they couldn't track us. "You're the ghosts from Ashenmere," she said when we appeared in her cellar, with more calm than was probably warranted. "Aldric sent word." "Aldric moves quickly for a dead man," Yenna observed. "He has methods." Thessaly looked us over with the assessing eye of someone who has learned not to trust easily. "The stories about you were... I thought they were exaggerated." "Probably not exaggerated enough," I said. "Tell me about the hollow you've been waking." She had 17, scattered across the city, each one a fragment of a life. A carpenter, 2 former teachers, a woman who'd been a midwife, a soldier, a cook who still moved through the glass court's kitchens like she owned them. 17 small rebellions against 3 centuries of silence. "They're scared," Thessaly said. "Waking up is. It's not peaceful. It's terrifying. You have all these memories, and then you have your current situation, and the distance between them is—" "I know," I said quietly. She looked at me. Remembered I was a ghost. Amended. "Right. Of course. A beat. What do we do?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since we crossed Velundra's threshold. What we'd done in Ashenmere couldn't be done here. The dependency problem changed everything. You couldn't just flood the city with freed essence and call it healing. You'd be poisoning the cure. But there was something I'd noticed during our 2 days of observation. Something in how the glass chains moved. "The chains don't just distribute essence outward," I said slowly, working it out as I spoke. "They also collect it. Every person in this city generates small amounts of soul essence naturally. Emotion, experience, living. The chains harvest that ambient energy and funnel it back to the glass court." Thessaly stared at me. "I didn't know that. Because it's so small you'd never notice. But over 300 years, with 180,000 living people, it adds up. The glass court doesn't just give the city a trickle of essence through the water. They take far more back than they ever give." "So the chains are a net," Yenna said. "Not a tap. The dependency is real. I'm not saying it isn't. But it's been exaggerated. Deliberately. The glass court wants the living population to believe they'll die without the essence infusion. It keeps them from ever questioning the arrangement. Aldric, I realized, had known this. He'd been careful with his words. The experiments were 240 years old. The dependency would be significant, but he hadn't said catastrophic. He hadn't said fatal. He'd been precise in a way that suggested he was more hopeful than he'd allowed himself to show. "So what do we do?" Thessaly asked again. "We steal the chains," I said. "Not destroy them. Steal them. Redirect them. Turn what the glass court built to take from this city into something that gives back." Part 3. The heist that couldn't happen. The week between deciding to act and acting was the strangest week I'd spent since dying. Yenna and I had been ghosts for a long time. We knew how to exist in that state, how to move through walls, how to observe without being observed, how to influence essence and speak to the hollow. We'd done it across dozens of cities, helping where we could, moving on when the work was done. But this was different. This felt more like the old days. The Ashenmere days. The days when we were still flesh and blood, and the problems in front of us required the kind of thinking you did with your whole body, not just whatever fragment of consciousness persists after death. I'd missed it, I realized. The particular sharpness of a plan coming together. The way pieces that seemed incompatible suddenly revealed their fit. The gambler's clarity that descends when you've bet everything and there's nothing left to do but play the hand. Thessaly proved invaluable in ways that went beyond her printing press and her 17 waking hollow. She knew the city's surface, its rhythms, its social geography, the particular way that Velundra's living population organized itself around the glass court's invisible architecture. She knew which districts were more heavily supervised and which were effectively left to themselves. She knew the maintenance schedules for the city's infrastructure workers, who were the only living people allowed near the chain network relay stations. She also knew, which surprised me, about ghosts. My grandmother used to say that certain places remembered their dead, she told me on the third evening, sitting in her cellar with a cup of cold tea and a stack of maps. Not just in the way places do, the way a room still smells like someone who used to live there, but actively remembered. She said there were people who chose to stay after they died because they weren't finished. She was right, I said. She also said they were usually trouble. Thessaly looked at me with an expression that was more fond than accusing. She was right about that too. Aldric, meanwhile, was managing a logistical operation of considerable complexity, coordinating 15 waking hollow across the city who needed to be in specific positions at a specific time without drawing attention to themselves. The difficulty was that any deviation from their normal routes risked triggering the glass court's monitoring system, the same system that detected waking hollow and sent them for reprocessing. They had to move normally, act like standard hollow, get to their positions without appearing to be doing anything other than their assigned duties. It turned out that 60 years plus 11 years of archival experience was excellent preparation for coordinating a covert operation. Aldric issued his instructions through a chain of dead drops, documents filed in the archive in seemingly random locations, which the waking hollow collected during their normal work routines. "You've done this before," Yenna said, watching him work. "Not exactly this," Aldric replied. "But in the years before I died, I preserved documents the glass court had ordered destroyed. I built hidden caches throughout the archive. I learned to move information through a system designed to prevent information from moving." A pause. It seemed like the right skill to develop. "Why?" Thessaly asked. "You were their head archivist. You were trusted." "I was trusted," Aldric agreed. "I betrayed that trust as thoroughly as I could, for as long as I could." Something shifted in his face. "I had a family. I had a daughter. She was 32 when she died in a factory accident. There were many factory accidents in the districts where the glass court needed replacement hollow. I knew what happened to the bodies. I knew where she went." Silence. "I never found her," he said. "By the time I understood the system well enough to know where she would have been processed, she'd been fully consumed. Nothing left to recover." His hands were still on the desk before him, dead hands, preserved past their natural time. "I stayed. I preserved what I could. I waited for someone to come who could finish what I couldn't. I thought of Maven, who had waited years in Ashenmere for the same reason. Of all the people who had found themselves inside terrible systems and chosen, at great cost, to remain rather than accept. The capacity for patience in the face of injustice was one of the more humbling things I'd observed in my time as a ghost. I want to be honest about something. The plan we developed over the following week was, by any reasonable measure, insane. In Ashenmere, Kael, the living thief, had been good at his job. He'd had skills, tools, a working body with functional hands, and the ability to physically interact with the world. Kael the ghost had different capabilities. I could move through walls, which was useful. I couldn't pick a lock, which was limiting. I could speak to the hollow, which was valuable. I couldn't carry a marrow vial, which was occasionally very inconvenient. But I'd been a ghost for, by my rough estimate, somewhere between 50 and 100 years at this point. I'd learned things. Ghosts can't touch physical objects directly. What we can do is exert influence over essence, the same marrow energy that animated the hollow, that flowed through the glass chains, that the glass court traded and hoarded and weaponized. That energy recognized us, responded to us. After Ashenmere, after all those freed souls and returned essence, we'd become something that the fundamental mechanics of soul magic acknowledged. The chains couldn't see us, but we could feel them, pull at them, redirect them, if we understood their structure well enough. That's where Aldric came in. Over 3 days of increasingly urgent meetings in the subterranean archive, the Archivist laid out everything he knew about the glass chain system, its history, its architecture, its pressure points. He'd spent 11 years studying it from the inside, cataloguing its vulnerabilities with the patient thoroughness of a scholar who has nothing but time and a very specific grudge. The chains had 3 critical nodes: the grand refinement chamber beneath House Oshen, where raw essence was processed, the distribution hub beneath the central square, where processed essence was split into the city's infusion network, and the collection terminus beneath House Veridine, where ambient soul energy harvested from the living population was stored before being converted. Control the nodes, and you controlled the chains. Destroy the nodes, and you broke the chains, with the dependency cascade we were trying to avoid. Redirect the nodes, and you could turn the entire system inside out. Instead of collecting ambient essence from the people and giving them a carefully metered trickle in return, you could return everything the glass court had stolen. 300 years of harvested soul energy, released back into the city, distributed to the hollow, given back to whoever it had been taken from. That would break the physical glass chains too, Aldric noted. The crystalline structure depends on the specific directional flow. Reverse it, and they'd shatter. Is that a problem? I asked. For the glass court? Catastrophic. For the city? He considered. There would be chaos. 300 years of change concentrated into hours. But the city would survive. Better than it currently is. What about the hollow? Thessaly asked. All of them, not just the 17 I've reached. What happens when that much essence flows back through the system? Aldric was quiet for a moment. I think, he said carefully, that many of them would wake. Not just fragments, like me or your 17. Fully. Because the essence being returned would include their own, the pieces taken from them when they were harvested. And the ones whose essence has already been consumed, the ones whose souls are gone completely. They rest, I said. Properly. Finally. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the kind that forms around a decision that can't be unmade. How do we access the nodes? Yenna asked, bringing us back to practical ground with the efficiency that had always been her greatest gift. They're under Marrow Lord houses. Guarded. Warded. 2 of the 3, Aldric said. The collection terminus under House Veridine is less secure. They're the weakest of the 3 families, and they've let their defenses slip. The distribution hub under Central Square is theoretically public infrastructure, but access is controlled. The grand refinement chamber under House Oshen is. He paused. Essentially impenetrable. Essentially, I noted. There are no ghost wards, he said, because the glass court doesn't believe in ghosts. They know about essence, soul magic, the hollow, but genuine hauntings, free-willed spirits? In their theology, that's superstition, a dry sound that might have been a laugh. They were wrong. So we can walk through their walls, Yenna said. What then? We can influence essence, but we can't physically manipulate the machinery. That's what your living allies are for, Aldric said. He looked at Thessaly. And that's what you've been preparing for, whether you knew it or not. Thessaly blinked. My 17 hollow? Plus me, Aldric said. 18 of us who remember, who can follow complex instructions, who have access to parts of the city's infrastructure that no living person would be allowed near. He straightened, and I saw in the gesture the shadow of the man he'd been, a man accustomed to organizing, to directing, to making things happen in institutions. I know the layout of all 3 nodes. I've been in all of them. I have maps. He reached behind the shelf beside him and produced a stack of papers so thick it must have been accumulating for years. I've been waiting, he said simply, for someone to come who knew how to use them. Part 4. The Night of Glass. We had one night. Not because it was the only opportunity, but because the Glass Court had begun a systematic search of the city's hollow, looking for signs of waking consciousness. They'd found 2 of Thessaly's 17 already. Both had been reprocessed, taken back to the Grand Refinement Chamber, and their remaining sparks of awareness stripped out. The thought of it made something cold move through what remained of my chest. We couldn't afford to wait for a better moment. The better moment would never come. The plan was this. Aldric and the 15 remaining conscious hollow would move to their positions across the city, each one responsible for a specific section of the glass chain network. Thessaly, with the maps Aldric had provided, would enter the collection terminus under House Veridine disguised as a maintenance worker. Yenna would guide her through, invisible at her shoulder, warning of guards and ward triggers. I would go to the Grand Refinement Chamber. Alone. The Grand Refinement Chamber was where the Glass Court met to oversee essence processing. On any normal night, it was staffed by a skeleton crew of living technicians and senior hollow under tight supervision. But twice a month, the 3 Lord families gathered there for what they called accounting, an assessment of the city's essence reserves. Tonight was a counting night. You're walking into a room full of the 3 most powerful Marrow Lords in Velundra, Yenna said when I explained this part. She had a specific tone for situations like this, one I'd last heard when I told her my plan to flood the Ashenmere vaults with freed soul energy, while they're actively using their most powerful magic. On purpose. Yes. And what are you going to do when you get there? Talk to them. The silence that followed was long enough for Yenna to cycle through disbelief, argument, and resignation in sequence. You're going to try to convince 3 immortal tyrants to voluntarily give up their power, she said. No, I said. I'm going to keep them distracted long enough for everyone else to do their jobs. There's a difference. A subtle one. An important one. She thought about it. How long do you need? 30 minutes. Maybe 40. To distract 3 people who could theoretically unmake you if they knew how. They don't know how. That's rather the point. She looked at me for a long moment, and in her expression I saw the full history of our partnership, the jobs that had gone wrong, the moments we'd nearly lost each other, the years of working in tandem until we'd learned to trust each other's judgment even when we thought it was terrible judgment. Don't get unmade, she said finally. Do my best, I promised. The counting happened in the lowest level of House Ashen, in a chamber lined with glass panels that were part display screen, part control interface for the chain network. The 3 Lord families stood at a central console. I could see them as I drifted through the stone walls, watching essence readings scroll past in columns of cold blue light. Lord Ashen was ancient, older than anything living should be, his body maintained by 3 centuries of stolen life until it had become something no longer quite human, too thin, too still, eyes that had seen too much and processed it into data rather than experience. Lady Veridine stood to his left, younger-looking but with the same fundamental wrongness about the eyes. Lord Psalm, the youngest of the 3, was merely 160 years old by my estimate, only an infant by their standards. They were arguing. The search is disrupting the Hollow's efficiency, Lady Veridine was saying. If we pull too many from their posts for reprocessing, The service networks suffer. Citizens notice. Citizens noticing nothing is the point, Lord Ashen replied, his voice carrying the flat patience of someone who has had this argument many times. If they notice irregularities in the hollow, they start asking questions. They already ask questions, Lord Som said. The pamphlets. The pamphlets are the problem, Ashen snapped. Someone is distributing information about the system, about what we are. He said the last word like it referred to something factual rather than shameful. That someone must be found. The pamphlets were printed on a press registered to a paper merchant in the Tanners district, Veradine said. We're watching the location. I filed that away. Thessaly's press. They knew about it, which meant Thessaly was in more danger than we'd realized. I also noted that in their focus on the pamphlets, on the search, on the political arguments of who was responsible for what, they were distracted. Genuinely distracted, in the way that powerful people get distracted, convinced that the most important problems are the ones they can see. Good. I moved to the center of the chamber, positioned myself between the three of them and the control console, and made myself visible. Good evening, I said. The reaction was instructive. Veradine took a step back. Som made a sharp movement toward the wall, where, I suspected, there was some kind of alarm or weapon. Ashen didn't move at all, which was either composure or the paralysis of genuine shock. What? Ashen said, after a moment. It wasn't quite a question. A ghost, Veradine said. She recovered faster than the others, I noted. There are ghost signatures in the chain readings. I assumed it was interference. You should have calibrated for it, I said pleasantly. There are two of us, actually, though my partner is occupied elsewhere at the moment. Som had reached the wall. His hand was on something. I watched him try to activate it and fail, watched the confusion cross his face, watched him try again. That won't work, I said. The alarm connects to the chain network. We've been disrupting it gently for the past hour. Not enough to trigger a cascade, just enough to create some static. You won't be able to call for help. That was actually Aldric's work, though I was happy to take credit for it if it kept the three of them looking at me. What do you want? Ashen asked. He'd found his composure. 3 centuries of practice at projecting absolute authority. It didn't fail him even now. I want to tell you a story, I said, about a city called Ashenmere. Ashen's expression shifted, barely visible, but I was looking for it. We know about Ashenmere. Then you know it fell. You know the Marrow Lords there lost everything. But I wonder if you understand why. They were sloppy, Veradine said crisply. They allowed resentment to build among the hollow. They didn't manage the system carefully enough. Interesting analysis, I said. Would you like to hear mine? I'd learned something important in the years since Ashenmere. The most useful thing a ghost could do in a confrontation wasn't to threaten or to terrify. It was to talk, to keep talking, to hold attention with words while other things happened elsewhere. So I talked. I told them about Ashenmere, not the version they'd heard, the cautionary tale about poor management, but the real version, about what the soul trade actually cost, about what it felt like to be hollow, the fragments of humanity that survived even the most thorough harvesting, about Maven and Ceres, about Lyris and her bread and her brown eyes returning to her face. I told them about what happened to cities that built themselves on extraction, how the debt always came due, how the longer the system ran, the more catastrophic the eventual collapse. And while I talked, I watched the control console behind them, the essence readings on the glass panels, watched as, slowly, the numbers began to shift. Thessaly was at the collection terminus. The Hollow were at their positions across the network. "You're stalling," Lord Ashen said. He was looking at the console now, the readings. "Something is happening to the network." "Yes," I agreed. "It is. Stop it." His voice was absolute, the voice of 3 centuries of being obeyed. "Whatever you've set in motion, stop it now. If the chains break uncontrolled, the dependency cascade. Won't be as bad as you've told everyone it would be," I said. "We know about the exaggeration. We know the ambient harvest is far larger than the return feed. We know the dependency is real but not fatal." Something crossed his ancient face. Not fear exactly. Something more like the recognition of checkmate. "You're going to destroy everything," Veradine said. "No," I said. "We're going to redirect everything. There's a difference." Then the glass chains began to sing. It started as a vibration beneath hearing. I felt it rather than heard it, a tremor in the essence fabric of the city. Then it climbed in frequency until it was audible, a high, pure tone that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the city itself, from the accumulated soul energy of 300 years finally moving in a different direction. The panels on the chamber walls blazed white. Lord Ashen reached for the console. "Don't," I said, and for the first time I let him see what I was. Not just a ghost, but something that had passed through death and come back with purpose, something that had absorbed the gratitude of 10,000 freed souls and carried it forward. The light that came off me in that moment wasn't threatening. It was just undeniable. He stopped. The glass chains, all across the city, began to shatter. In the grand refinement chamber, the control panels went dark. Lord Ashen stood very still. Lady Veradine sat down heavily on the floor, which struck me as oddly human. Lord Psalm was crying, silently, without seeming to notice he was doing it. I stayed with them as it happened, watched 3 people who had lived so far past their natural span that they'd forgotten what it felt like to be mortal, suddenly confronted with the fact that everything they'd built was over. Ashen recovered first. He was old enough and cold enough that practicality came before grief. "You've made a catastrophic mistake," he said. His voice was even. "The dependency will kill people. The living population. We'll be sick for a few weeks," I said. "Some longer. It won't be pleasant. But they'll survive." I paused. "You knew the exaggeration wasn't accurate. You maintained it anyway." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "The system worked. For you. For everyone. The city has been stable, healthy, prosperous for 3 centuries. People live long lives here. They're comfortable. They're dependent on stolen life without knowing it," I said. "And 400,000 dead people have been serving as your infrastructure." The coldness I'd felt when Aldric told us about the reprocessing was still there, still sharp. "That's not a system working. That's a crime that hasn't been named yet." "You sound like a revolutionary pamphlet," Ashen said. "You sound like everyone who's ever been comfortable at someone else's expense and called it civilization," I replied. He had nothing to say to that. Not because I was wrong, but because he'd known I wasn't wrong for a very long time, and had simply decided that knowing didn't require him to change. Veradine spoke from the floor. She hadn't gotten up. "What happens to us now?" "That's not my decision," I said. "That's the city's decision. The Council of Waking that's forming tonight will have to work that out with the living population." I looked at Psalm, who had stopped crying and was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Some of you may face consequences. Some of you may choose to help with the transition, and that choice might matter. I genuinely don't know. You've destroyed everything we built," Ashen said. And under the evenness, I finally heard something. Not grief, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of a very old person who has held something together for too long and has finally, against their will, been permitted to stop. What you built was wrong, I said, as gently as I could. But the city is real. The people in it are real. What they build next, that's up to them. The control panels stayed dark. The chains, all across Velundra, finished their shattering. The accumulated essence of 3 centuries moved outward through the city like a tide, finding every hollow thing and filling it, giving back what had been taken. And in the deepest parts of Velundra's architecture, 400,000 dead finally rested, or remembered. Across the city, in the distribution hub beneath Central Square, Thessaly was doing something considerably less philosophical. She told me about it later, in fragments, as she processed what had happened. The hub was a vast circular chamber beneath the square, filled with crystalline machinery that looked organic, like something grown rather than built, glass formations rising from the floor in structures that resembled both coral and bones. At the center, a slowly rotating column of marrow essence moved in a contained spiral, maintaining the pressure that pushed the infusion through the city's water system. Thessaly had gotten in through a maintenance access that Aldric's maps identified as minimally monitored. Yenna had guided her through 3 checkpoints, whispering directions, using just enough ghost influence on the essential flow to keep the ward alerts from triggering. In the hub, Yenna had done something neither of us had planned for. There was a hollow in the chamber, a maintenance worker who had been stationed there for what Thessaly estimated was decades, based on the wear pattern in the floor around her position. Not one of their 17. Not someone they'd reached. Just a hollow, doing her job in the automated way of the fully processed dead. But when the essence from the chains began to redirect, began to flow back through the system, the hollow had stopped, turned, looked at Yenna with eyes that, for just a moment, caught the returning essence and held it. I think she recognized me, Yenna told me later, with an expression I'd rarely seen on her face. Something between wonder and pain. From before she died, maybe, or from I don't know. From somewhere. She looked at me like she knew who I was. Did you know her? No. But she grabbed my hand. Yenna looked at her own ethereal hand. I didn't think the hollow could touch ghosts, but she grabbed my hand and she held on, and the essence was flowing back through her, and I could feel, Kael, I could feel her remembering. The hollow woman had fully woken in the 30 seconds it took for the returning essence to reach her. Not a fragment like Aldric, not a piece of what she'd been. Fully, screaming with the force of it, 30 years of absence flooding back in an instant. Her name was Sora. She'd been a canal engineer. She'd died at 47 in an accident that wasn't really an accident, the same way Aldric's daughter had died. She was the first of the 60,000. Part 5. After the breaking. The sound of 100,000 glass chains shattering simultaneously is not something I'll forget, even if I eventually move on to wherever comes after. It wasn't violent. That's the thing I'd been most afraid of, and it wasn't. No shattering windows, no collapsing buildings, no people thrown off their feet by some magical shockwave. Just a sound, that high ringing note reaching its peak and then releasing, like a bell that had been struck and finally stopped reverberating, and then an absence. The weight of 3 centuries of soul magic lifting off a city. In the grand refinement chamber, the control panels went dark. The 3 lords stood in the ruin of their life's work, and I left them to it. There was nothing more to say that the next few days wouldn't say more clearly. In the streets of Velundra, people stopped what they were doing. Not because anything obvious happened. No explosion, no spectacle. But 3 centuries of low-level marrow infusion in the water supply had created a kind of background hum, not painful, not even noticeable until it stopped. The sudden quiet of it was like the silence after a clock you'd stopped hearing suddenly stops. You didn't know you'd been listening until you weren't anymore. People looked at each other. Some described it later as a feeling of clarity, like a slight fog lifting that they hadn't known was there. Others felt immediate nausea as their bodies registered the withdrawal. A few simply sat down wherever they were and started crying, without knowing why. In the Tanner's district, Thessaly's pamphlets were already in circulation. By morning, every household in the city would have access to the truth. What happened in the first 24 hours of Velundra's reckoning was, in retrospect, somewhat miraculous. Not peaceful. There was panic, there was fear, there were some ugly confrontations between Glass Court loyalists and people who had just read what the court had done to the city's dead. But there was also, almost immediately, the thing that I'd come to believe was humanity's most underrated capacity: organization. Sora, the canal engineer who had been the first to fully wake, apparently emerged from the distribution hub like a force of nature. 30 years of administrative experience suddenly returned to her, combined with a very clear understanding of exactly what the city's infrastructure looked like from the inside. Within 6 hours of waking, she'd organized the 53 other fully woken engineers and technicians among the waking hollow into a working team tasked with ensuring Velundra's water supply, sanitation, and canal systems continued functioning during the transition. Practical problems, she told Thessaly, were better than existential ones. They gave people something to do with their hands while their minds caught up. Aldric, characteristically, went back to the archive. He spent the first night after the breaking cataloguing everything he knew about the chain system structure, not for the Glass Court, but for the Council of Waking that was assembling itself in the central square, and for the historians who would eventually need to understand what had happened here. Lord Som did, as Yenna had said, cooperate. He spent 3 days walking through his district, talking to people, living people, waking hollow, anyone who would listen. What he said, from what Thessaly reported, was complicated and honest. Here is what I did, here is what I knew, here is what I told myself to justify it, here is why those justifications were wrong. He was the only one of the 3 Glass Court families who had what I would call a reckoning rather than a collapse. Whether that redeemed him was for Velundra to decide. Not us. Lord Oshen retreated into his estate and did not emerge for a week. When he did, he was diminished. Not physically, not yet, but in the way people are diminished when the story they've told themselves about who they are no longer holds together. He would spend years, I suspected, being a problem for the city's new governance structures to manage. Lady Veridine's vault was found empty 3 days after the breaking. She had gone, taking what small reserve of stored essence she'd kept separately from the main system, retreating to somewhere beyond the city's reach. Not unlike Lady Vetherin in Ashenmere, running for the hills with whatever she could carry. The pattern was remarkably consistent across different cities, different centuries. The ones who ran were always the ones who had the most to run from and the least capacity for the kind of change that staying would require. The withdrawal symptoms in the living population were real and genuinely difficult. About a third of the population experienced significant physical symptoms in the first 2 weeks: exhaustion, headaches, sensitivity to cold, in some cases more serious complaints that required medical attention. The city's healers and physicians were overwhelmed. But people didn't die. Not from the withdrawal. Some who were already very ill took a turn for the worse, and a few of those died, and that was tragic and real. But the catastrophic cascade the Glass Court had predicted, had, Yenna and I increasingly believed, deliberately exaggerated, did not materialize. What the Glass Court hadn't accounted for was what happened when 60,000 waking hollow discovered they still had their skills, their knowledge, their lifetimes of professional experience. Among them were doctors and nurses and healers who had died and been pressed into service as maintenance workers and kitchen staff. They woke up remembering everything they'd known in life. By the end of the first week, More than 200 former medical professionals were working alongside the city's living healers. The combination of Velundra's existing healthcare infrastructure and the institutional knowledge of people who had been practicing medicine before they died and had now returned to consciousness created something unusual. A healthcare system with a sudden and dramatic increase in capacity exactly when that capacity was most needed. Sora called it the first gift of the waking. She had a talent for naming things. Yenna found me on the evening of the 7th day, sitting on a canal wall and watching the lights of the city reflected in the water. Velundra at night was different now. The glass chains had distributed a faint luminescence that had been such a constant part of the city's nights that its absence was immediately visible. The streets were darker, lit only by lanterns and windows, and somehow that darkness felt more honest, less managed. "How are you?" she asked. It was a question she didn't ask often. We'd been partners long enough that we'd developed a mutual understanding that some states didn't need naming. "Tired," I said. "Is that possible? Can ghosts be tired?" "I'm always tired," Yenna said, settling beside me. "I think it's less about physical exhaustion and more about," she gestured vaguely, "the weight of carrying. You care. You carry the carrying. Eventually the carrying catches up with you." Poetic. "I have my moments." She was quiet for a while. Thessaly asked if we'd stay. Help with the transition. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd ask you." I looked at the city's reflected lights. Velundra was going to be fine, I thought. Not immediately, not smoothly, not without conflict and backsliding and the 1,000 ways that even the best intentions could go wrong. But the fundamental materials were there. The waking hollow who remembered, the living people who now knew the truth, a young woman with ink-stained fingers, and an archivist who had been waiting 71 years to do something useful with everything he knew. They didn't need us anymore. They never really had. What they'd needed was a push. Someone to believe the mechanism could be dismantled and know enough about mechanisms to be right. That's what we'd provided. The rest was theirs. "We should go," I said. "Before Petra pushes us somewhere else?" Yenna asked. "Before we start to think of this as our city instead of theirs," I said. "That's the mistake you make, staying too long. You start to feel ownership of the thing you helped build. And then instead of help you're offering management." Yenna considered this. "You've been thinking about this for a while. Since Ashenmere. Since we stayed there for 100 years and watched it change and were proud of it, like proud parents." I paused. "We earned the right to be proud. But it wasn't ours. It was never ours." "No," she agreed. "But it's hard to let go of things you love." "I know," I said. "That's why we practice." Below us, on the canal, something was floating. I looked more closely. A flower. Blue petals shot through with veins of silver. The same flower that had bloomed in Ashenmere's garden when we'd finally let go. It drifted past us on the dark water, glowing faintly, headed somewhere. We followed it into the night. Yenna found me 3 hours later, sitting on the canal wall in the Tanner's district, watching the city move through its first night of chaos. "How many?" I asked. "Waking fully?" "Aldric says somewhere between 40 and 60,000. She settled beside me. The rest were too far gone. They had their piece. 60,000. Out of 400,000. Not the sweeping liberation of Ashenmere, where we'd freed thousands simultaneously. Here the numbers were grimmer, the damage of 3 centuries showing in how little remained. But 60,000 was 60,000. The living population? I asked. Scared. Confused. Some of them angry. They don't know what's happened yet. The glass court is blaming the hollow for some kind of malfunction. She paused. That won't last. Thessaly's been busy. I looked at her. The pamphlets, Yenna said. She printed them before she went to the terminus. 30,000 copies. She had the city's hollow deliver them tonight while everything was in chaos. I thought about the press in the Tanner's district, now sitting dark and silent with a glass court watching it. She used a different press. She used 40 different presses, borrowed them from every print shop in the city during the past week. Aldric helped organize it. Yenna smiled her rusty smile. The scholar has been busy. Down the canal, I could see lights in windows, people waking, reading pamphlets, beginning to understand what they'd been part of. Some windows showed argument, which was healthy. Some showed people weeping. One window showed someone tearing a pamphlet apart in rage, which was also healthy in its way. At least they were reacting. The glass court? I asked. Ashen hasn't left the refinement chamber. Veridine went to her family vault and locked herself in. Sam is talking to people, going street by street in his district, trying to explain, trying to manage the story. Yenna was quiet for a moment. He's been doing it for 2 hours. He hasn't lied once. Really? He's 160 years old. Maybe he's different from the others. Maybe he's just tired. She shrugged. Either way, he's cooperating with the Council of Waking that Thessaly and Aldric are putting together. A Council of Waking. The same structure that had emerged in Ashenmere, independently, because it was the right shape for this kind of transition. I found that comforting, that even different cities, facing different versions of the same problem, found their way to similar solutions. Will it hold? I asked. I don't know, Yenna said honestly. It's going to be messy. The withdrawal symptoms are real. The medics are overwhelmed. People are sick, frightened. The waking hollow are disoriented. The living population is divided. The glass court still exists, even if it's broken. And there are other cities. There are always other cities. And they'll be watching, seeing if Velundra falls apart or comes through. We sat with that for a while. Below us, the canal caught the lights of a city in the first hours of its reckoning, confused and painful and absolutely necessary. I've been thinking, Yenna said after a while, dangerous, about Petra's note, about being pushed here rather than sent. She looked at me sideways. I don't think we're done. No, I agreed. The note said last major stronghold, which implies there are minor ones. And other things. Problems that don't fit the Marrow Lord pattern exactly, but are related, adjacent, part of the same history. She paused. When we freed the souls in Ashenmere, they went somewhere. The ones who moved on. They went somewhere, and they're aware. They know about us. They knew about Velundra before we did. Petra knew, I said slowly. Somehow. From them, Yenna confirmed. From the souls we freed. They can see the world from wherever they are, and they can push. Not hard, not directing exactly, but nudging, I said. Nudging certain people and certain ghosts towards certain problems. And they're going to keep doing it, Yenna said. Because the soul trade didn't start with Ashenmere, and it didn't end with Velundra. It's been part of the world for centuries. And wherever it exists, wherever someone is being exploited for their essence, being treated as a resource rather than a person. We're going to find out about it, I finished. We're going to be pushed toward it. We sat with that. The implication of it. A life, a death, of being necessary, of being the thing that exists at the intersection of the living world and whatever comes after, because someone has to. Below us, a woman was sitting in a doorway, reading a pamphlet. She was young, maybe 20, and her face moved through a sequence of emotions as she read. Confusion, disbelief, something that resolved slowly into a kind of terrible clarity. I watched her finish reading, fold the pamphlet carefully, and put it in her pocket. Then she stood up, looked down the street, and walked toward the sound of voices. Not away from the chaos. Into it. Partners, Yenna said. Partners, I agreed. In death and whatever keeps coming after. She extended her ethereal hand. I took it. Down in the canal below us, something was floating. I looked more closely. A flower. Blue petals shot through with veins of silver, the same flower that had bloomed in Ashenmere's garden when we'd finally let go. It drifted past us on the dark water, glowing faintly, headed somewhere. We followed it into the night. Epilogue. A note found in the Velundra archive, written in an unfamiliar hand, filed under uncatalogued. Asterisk to whoever reads this asterisk. Asterisk my name is Aldric. I was the head archivist of Velundra for 60 years before I died, and the dead head archivist for 11 years after. Last night, the city I spent my life serving began the long work of becoming something better than what it was, asterisk. Asterisk I don't know if I'll wake fully. The essence that returned to us all last night was distributed unevenly, and what came back to me was only a fragment of what was taken. I may not have long, asterisk. So I want to write down what I observed, while I still can. Asterisk the ones who did this were ghosts. I know how that sounds. I've spent 71 years in this archive, and I've learned to be precise with words, so I'll try to be precise now. They were not spirits, not manifestations, not the kind of haunting that old stories describe. They were people who had died and continued. People who retained will, identity, the capacity for complex action, and directed those things toward a specific purpose. Asterisk. Asterisk I don't know where they came from. I don't know where they've gone. Asterisk. Asterisk I know what they left behind. A city in chaos, yes. But also 60,000 of the dead with their names back. 40 pamphlets worth of truth distributed to 180,000 people who deserved to know it. The beginning of a council of waking that will almost certainly make many mistakes and get many things wrong before it gets them right. Asterisk. And one very old archivist who stayed awake long enough to write this. Asterisk I've spent my life cataloguing other people's records. I'd like, before I rest, to leave one of my own. Asterisk. Asterisk the world is full of systems built on taking. Built on the premise that some people can be treated as resources, that some lives can be used to extend or enrich others. These systems are always presented as necessary, as civilizational, as the foundation of order. Asterisk. Asterisk they are not. They are choices, and choices can be unmade. Asterisk. Asterisk it takes thieves, sometimes. People who understand both sides of the vault door. People who have been inside the mechanism and know where the levers are. Asterisk. Asterisk it takes the dead, sometimes. People who have nothing left to lose and everything to give. Asterisk. It takes ordinary people reading pamphlets in doorways, deciding to walk toward the voices rather than away from them. The ghosts were right about one thing above all else. The greatest theft isn't taking from the powerful. It's stealing people back from the systems that consume them. Signed, Aldric, former head archivist of Velundra. Written in the first hour of the first morning of a new kind of city. Filed under uncatalogued. Cross-reference. Hope. End of Book 2. The story of the Marrow Thieves continues.